Hey everyone, welcome to episode 5 of the Elder Council podcast. I'm your host, Jesse. This is the podcast where we do a little bit of coverage of everything D&D weekly, talking about new D&D news. We have recently kind of been forced to be just going over endless new subclasses that they've been releasing, which we're very spoiled to get all this awesome new content. Don't think I'm complaining. We've been doing the Unearthed Arcana subclasses every time they put those out. And we also do a quick glance at the monster manual, looking at some of my favorite monsters. And this week's episode is going to be a nice, short and sweet one. I don't have too much news to go over. I'll tell you guys a little bit of an update about my campaign that we run here every Wednesday on the Twitch channel. And I think that's about it. We'll do a little bit of an update and then we'll do the monster manual. No new subclasses this week. They gave us a break so we can continue to try to brew up some cool builds with the most recent ones. If you have not already seen the previous episodes of the podcast, check them out on YouTube or on the Twitch highlights. If you're watching this later on YouTube, twitch.tv/Elder Council every Thursday night is when we record live, and we have streams many other days of the week, including the live podcast and the live campaign, like I spoke about earlier, every Wednesday night. That's all 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, the live campaign, it went pretty well yesterday, and I've kind of fallen into the routine of every time we do like a cool battle on Wednesday night in the campaign, then I like to use that monster for our Monster of the Week in the next day's podcast. So last night we began a pretty sweet little mini boss encounter with the Mimic, which we'll talk about here shortly. So I do hate having to like end a session of D&D in the middle of a battle. Sometimes, it just winds up that way, even in your IRL campaigns, at your house or your friend's house or whatever. You get into a big fight and then somebody's got to go home. It gets too late and you got to split right in the middle of combat, and that always sucks. But it's doubly hard to avoid and hard to deal with when you're doing the stream campaign. So I'm constantly learning, doing this like my first campaign live on stream, and really DMing my first like fully like big homebrew campaign, and doing it live has presented many challenges, and I'm still learning and really enjoying that learning process. But man, every time we get into like a sweet battle and I'm really enjoying it and thinking it's really awesome for the stream, having to end the broadcast in the middle of that because I run out of time or I have to go do something, in real life and end the stream, it's a hassle. So we got about halfway through a epic Mimic battle, and I've just been kind of excited for this the whole time. I had planned this particular fight for quite a while, but I've been using Mimics in other contexts throughout the campaign for quite a while now, and they're one of my favorite monsters to use. If you somehow are new to D&D or RPGs in general and have just been, living under the tiniest of rocks, Mimics are obviously like shape-shifting animated chests most of the time in pop culture and stuff like that. That's how you're going to see them. They're really like monstrosities that can shape change into inanimate objects that when you least expect it or when you touch them, they spring to life and try to eat you. And they do that as some type of like shape-shifting hunting camouflage to trick their prey and to get food. They are very popular. They've been around in D&D since the beginning. I think maybe there's been stories of Mimics and they've been around in fantasy writing since longer than D&D, but I believe it was Gary Gygax in the very beginning that kind of coined the term and started the Mimic as we know it, as far as the animated chest with the giant mouth and teeth and acid and all that good stuff. I think back then there was even drawings of Mimics growing a big humanoid arm and punching people and stuff like that. So they've kind of been the silly, campy, dungeon monster since the very get-go. And then of course a little while later, when the official like first monster manual came out, they got a little bit more fleshed out, and it's just grown from there. But if you are not super familiar with the history of old school D&D and stuff, which I imagine most people listening to this are probably not going to be, you may have seen mimics in such incredible video games and franchises as Dark Souls or Prey, more recent title. Dark Souls is my first introduction to the mimic. I guess I had probably seen and heard of them just very lightly through, you know, pop culture references, and I guess like not even pop culture, like subculture type stuff, like seeing references to D&D and maybe Final Fantasy and stuff like that as like young kid in the 90s. But I think the first time I really got experience with mimics on my own was playing through the Dark Souls games, which I am a huge fan of. I think Dark Souls 1 is my favorite video game ever. And From Software's use of mimics in their games has always been incredible to me, and I really love that. And I try to emulate that a lot in my campaigns. So, how do you do that? And what is that to do? I guess if you haven't played Dark Souls, the mimic is both a good challenging test for your players. They I guess I'll get into this in a minute what their actual stats are, but they're a good challenging test to your players, and they're a fun way to kind of break the fourth wall as the DM and let your players know like at any time you can mess with them. And no matter how serious they're taking the game, if they're in the middle of like a heavy duty dungeon crawl and, you know, blood's flying, there's PCs that are possibly dying, they're really hitting it hard and trying to, you know, have this nitty gritty gameplay even in a very serious campaign. You throw a mimic at them, and it all stops for a minute, and they all just laugh. And even if it's a pretty serious encounter, and they can be dangerous sometimes, players will always laugh and enjoy stopping for a second to just think about how funny it is that they're fighting a chest or a door or whatever. You know, mimics are great, and if especially if you as the DM get to deploy a mimic in a way that they didn't expect, and you actually get them, you know, you surprise them with it and they didn't know it was going to be a mimic, and then they get attacked. It's always fun. Everyone always gives the biggest groan of like, okay, I you got me. It's so much fun. But let's just go into it really quick. The base 5th edition mimic, which they've changed a lot over the years, there's actually been, I think, maybe in 3rd or 4th edition, there was some stat blocks on some other types of like weird mimics, and you could definitely go back and check those out and mine those for some inspiration. But just standard 5e mimic is a CR2 monster, and I'll give you guys some tips on how to use that at higher and lower levels. So it's CR2, about 60 HP. It's a 9d8, so it's 98 plus 18, so it's a 9th level, I guess, monster. CR2, speed of 15, super slow, and AC 12, super easy to hit. So what is the challenge to this? It does have a little bit of a high HP for its challenge rating. So CR2, you can expect a party of, you know, an average number of level 2 characters to fight this thing. And it does have a relatively high HP for that level of party. At, you know, at 2nd level, your fighter and your wizard and your paladin or cleric or whatever, you're not going to be doing a whole lot. You're pretty much going to be doing base weapon damage per attack at that level, which, you know, if you maybe if you have a barbarian that's using a great axe or something, you might get lucky and do 12 to 14 damage per attack. So that's 60 attacks. That's at least 5 hits from your party total to take this thing down, and obviously not counting spells and stuff like that, which really spells at that level are not going to be doing a whole lot of damage either. So you can count on at least a full round of combat to take down a mimic, which if it gets the jump on you and gets an attack off and then gets to grapple one of your party members, which is kind of the thing that they do, they try to latch on and bite. So if they get the jump, get to attack first, and then a full round goes by and they get to attack again, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility if it was, you know, a weaker, squishier character for them to go down. So mimics can be dangerous and they can be a challenge, and I think that's a good thing. So in Dark Souls, just for the inspiration that I've always taken from these, they challenge the players because even after you got by your first mimic in Dark Souls, you still sometimes you get lulled into a false sense of security, and you'll just, you know, won't be thinking about it, and you'll just run up and grab a chest. You just got done clearing out a big room full of enemies, and you feel good about yourself. It was tough, you struggled, but you got through it, and you're like, yes, I deserve this reward. You run up, grab the chest, and it bites you in half and you die. Like, I just think that is great. It's such a, you know, a defeating moment sometimes, but if you use it correctly, it can really give your players both that funny sense of like the DM could be messing with us at any time, and it does over time. The more you do it, give them that sort of paranoia that is really fun to use against your players, where they will expect it. So every time someone in my campaigns, and you could see this last night, every time they see a chest, they expect it now. And sometimes I just do it anyways, just to feed into that expectation. So they're like, yep, I knew it. And sometimes it's just a normal chest. And then they're like, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be so paranoid. So you can really play with that dynamic. And once your party's paranoid of things, then you can really start to ramp it up and mess with them. If you are into that, if you're playing a campaign that is like slightly more on the dark or horror themed or anything like that, you can really use it to great effect. So in Dark Souls, if you're new to that game and you don't play D&D and you just start playing, you might not even know what a mimic is. So the first time you see a chest, you're like, oh, it's a video game. All right, they're going to give me some loot here. Run up to the chest, try to click the button to open it, and the chest bites you in half and you die. Then you're really going to be freaked out. And I think in D&D it's a little bit more difficult because most people, if they're not new players, are going to know. And even if you do have some new players in your party, somebody, you know, you're going to have someone that's read the monster manual and they saw the mimic and they thought it was interesting, or you'll have at least one veteran player and they'll kind of tip everybody off like, all right, be careful running up to that chest. So you have to deploy them in a little bit of a trickier and more subtle way, which sometimes if you are just trying to play with them and they are already paranoid, just put a regular chest in the room and they're going to walk up and somebody's going to hit it with a stick, and then the mimic will attack and they'll just have a quick little battle, no big deal. But you can do other things with them, and I'll just give you some examples straight out of the monster manual for the ways that they've described mimics, which I think people they have such a like a preconceived idea about mimics, since they're so popular and common in games now, that they don't even realize the things that you can do with them just straight out of the rule book here. Mimics are, right as it says, imitative predators and cunning hunters. So they can alter their outward texture to resemble wood, stone, and other basic materials, and they have evolved to assume the appearance of objects that other creatures are likely to come in contact with. Obviously, this is most commonly in the form of a treasure chest or a wooden door inside of a dungeon. So common things that someone's going to have to interact with or pass by and then be able to be attacked. But some interesting things that I don't think most people, I don't think I've ever heard anyone really mentioning this. Most mimics only have predatory intelligence. A rare few evolve greater cunning and the ability to carry on simple conversations in common or undercommon. Such mimics might allow safe passage through their domains or provide useful information in exchange for food. I have never even thought about or talked to anyone about using a mimic as, you know, a slightly intelligent creature that actually wants to bargain with somebody. And it seems like such a strange foreign idea. I don't think that is going to be common in anyone's game. You know, you never stumble across a mimic and you're super paranoid and you accidentally spring the trap and the mimic attacks, and then you talk to it. I've never imagined such a thing, but I think that that's such a cool idea if your campaign allows for that. If you're playing into that silly side of things, like I said, the mimic is already super kind of silly and campy, but if you and I know a lot of campaigns do this, if you're really playing that up and turning that silliness dial up a notch, then having, a talking mimic that maybe it follows the party around and they always run into the same mimic in their dungeons, and somehow it doesn't want to fight because it knows it would lose, so it always wants to bargain, and it wants the party to bring it rats and goblins in exchange for a little bit of treasure and coins and information that it finds about the dungeon, like almost like a Final Fantasy game or something, or Pokemon. Like you have these reoccurring characters that pop up in dungeons who end up being helpful guides, like the Virgil to Dante in the Divine Comedy, or the guy who is, man, I should probably know this guy's name, but the helpful trainer guide at the beginning of every gym in the Pokemon games, who gives you a little bit of hint and helpful information about the gym leader and the boss battles up ahead. This mimic could be that type of funny NPC who, as soon as the characters figure out it's the mimic, then they can, bring a rat or a goblin in exchange for some tips and tricks about the upcoming dungeon. I think that would be a really cool way to use mimics without having to just rely on, tricking your party, which usually won't work after the first time, because they're going to be on alert. Anytime they see a chest, they're just going to go ahead and shoot it from across the room before they approach, and that kind of spoils the fun. So that would be an interesting way to do it. One thing I wanted to talk about here before we go is using mimics at higher levels, not just CR2, and they can be strong. So against a second level party, like I said earlier, you have to be careful. If you know that your sorcerer is always the guy who runs up and opens the chest first, you might want to be careful, because the mimic is going to latch onto him and start attacking, and the sorcerer might go down before the rest of the party can catch up and kill the mimic if your party is maybe a little bit on the weaker side damage wise. So they are powerful, but once you get past that kind of low level hurdle and into the second tier of gameplay, in between maybe 5th and 10th level, they're not really a challenge, and they're more of just, a funny prank type thing to play. So you might want to turn up the challenge. Maybe you have heard of some of these interesting mimic encounters that other people have done, and I've heard some really funny stories. Speaking of the mimic inside the mimic, here we have the funny artwork on the channel here. If you're listening to this later, definitely come by the stream or the YouTube and check it out. We've got some awesome graphics and artwork here. But there's many stories of people using mimics in creative ways, and you don't even have to change their stats. You can just use more than one of them, or use them in dangerous situations. So maybe the chest is on a secluded area with like a spike traps and pits and stuff like that, and the players have to really acrobatically try to get to the chest, and then when they do, it's the mimic. So then the entire battle room is this acrobatic trapped area, and now they're like fighting this rabid chest monster, and it just makes the whole thing a different dynamic. Or some of the really extreme cases I've seen, players will go into a room and every object in the room is a mimic. There's a table that's a mimic, and all of the cookware and silverware on the table are little mimics, and the rug is an animated rug that attacks, and the bookcases and all of that stuff. It's just a room full of mimics, and then there's a chest in the room, but the chest is not a mimic, and that's like the big joke. So they finally go up, they hack at the chest, and it doesn't attack back, so they're like, oh my gosh, all right, we killed all the mimics in the room, we can finally get the treasure. They open up the chest, and then there's like a magical spell book inside the treasure chest, and the book is a mimic. So they unlocked the reward, and then the reward was just another mimic, and you can do some really silly stuff like that. I think the best way to introduce that to a campaign is, if your characters have been going through like a little bit of a serious stretch of content, you've done 3 or 4 adventures or dungeons in a row where it's like really brutal stuff. If you've done maybe Tomb of Annihilation and Curse of Strahd, and they do have some, more role playing, lighthearted moments possible, but those are some pretty heavy duty, serious campaigns. Then maybe throw in like one of your own little homebrew adventures where they go in to like a little 1 or 2 room dungeon and they have the big mimic room just for some laughs, but it's also some good combat experience as well. And you can always throw some real treasure in the chests as well. That's something that I like to do that I think a lot of people have been surprised by. Most people, when they happen upon a mimic, they kill it and then they just expect it like, oh, it wasn't a real chest, it was a monster, it's dead now, and we carry on. But I like to have it still be, a treasure chest. Like you kill the mimic, you still get something cool, like some coins, or maybe the mimic was hoarding magic items and eating them for their power, and the last one that it ate hasn't been digested yet, so you kill the mimic and you get a cool magic item. I still try to do a little bit of that and not just like, oh, it wasn't a real chest, sorry, you're out of luck. That is no fun to me. So you can go the kind of prankster and creative route, or you can try to homebrew your own version of a mimic to use on higher level parties, which is what we're doing right now. Last night's campaign, the battle that we had to interrupt, unfortunately, we finished the session halfway through a battle, was with the super mimic that I kind of homebrewed up. It was a large footlocker type chest in a guard, like a military guard barracks. The barracks had been cleared out, all of the guards had been killed off and mysteriously disappeared. The players were just investigating this empty barracks, and they see the giant footlocker at the end of the room against the wall, and they're already suspicious because I've used mimics and stone cursed, which are like animated statues. I've been using this kind of stuff the entire campaign and getting them, so they're expecting the mimic, and they go up and they hit the chest, but it kind of just bounces like it's made out of rubber or something, and they just think it's super weird, so they hit it really hard, and then the rubber chest contracts and then it expands super huge, and it becomes this like large sized 10 by 10 giant chest mimic, and it pops out and it breaks a hole in the wall, and then they have to go outside and fight this thing in the giant courtyard, and it became a little bit of a mini boss battle. And the easiest way that I've found to beef up like these big tanky slow monsters and make them more dangerous for higher level encounters is not only can they do the close range grappling hard hitting attacks, give them a ranged ability. So one of the kind of magical items that I'm using in the campaign right now is these black stones that amplify magical powers. This mimic was a treasure chest full of these black stones, so now that it's a mimic, it has this ability to like almost cannon fire, like shoot out these black stones at the players. So it has the dangerous up close bite and grapple ability, and now it has almost like a cannon fire from long range, so it's doubly dangerous from any situation on the battlefield. And it's really, really interesting how they are approaching this fight, and I'm super excited to continue it next week. But just a quick short little podcast episode today. Just wanted to go into some of my favorite things about the mimic and interesting things that I've thought about doing with them. No other news other than that, but if you guys have any cool things that you've done with mimics, or any of those funny stories, room full of mimics type stuff, let me know in the comments on YouTube, or come by the stream live and check it out and let me know what your favorite thing about them is. One thing I did want to say, I kind of went into my inspiration for mimics from Dark Souls, but the game Prey that I mentioned earlier was more on the like anything could be a mimic line. If you haven't played that game, it's like a species of aliens that disguise themselves, and they turn into chairs, paintings, silverware, flowers, beds, whatever. Anything could be a mimic. So if you wanted to go that route, like kind of you could flesh out mimics into their own alien race that has kind of invaded this world, and they're like a plague that's everything is turning into mimics. I think that would be an interesting way to go as well, and you could take that slightly darker, more serious tone with them and have it work. So check out the game Prey. Way back in the day, Greenwood wrote The Ecology of Mimics, which was, kind of right after that early era when Gygax kind of coined the term and then put them in the early monster manual. There's that book. So The Ecology of Mimics, very, very old school, but fleshed out kind of basic, like everything about if mimics were like actual like wild animals, that would be the scientific literature about them. So there's some interesting writing to find about mimics if you're a fan. I'm a super nerd for these creatures, so I like try to digest everything I can about them. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think and what monsters you want to see more of in the future. So that'll be it for today's podcast. Like I said, nice quick one. We'll be back next week with another cool monster to be determined, and maybe some D&D news. We'll see what happens, but other than that, we'll give you some updates, and we'll be back next week. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.